Hi folks, welcome to video 4. This is a description of the scenario planning process. Now a couple things which are just worth saying right up front, and that is that this is a detailed process, so I'm going to move through this fairly quickly. And the reason for doing this is twofold. One is I want you to get an overall idea of what the process looks like. But the other thing is after this video, I then take the time to explain each stage again in much more detail, and I'll talk to you about examples along the way. So I don't think you've got to understand the whole process in all its detail first time around. So this video is simply to show you what the process looks like end to end, and we will go through the individual elements as you have to build your own scenario plan for the syndicate assignment as well as the individual assignment in a lot more detail as we go through the various parts of the program. So let's get underway and let's get right into the scenario planning process. Video 4. So what do we cover in this video? We look at a few things. In fact, we look at quite a few things. We look at 6 elements here. We look at the focus of scenario planning, where it should be used and how it should be used. We look at the key steps, which starts off with the definition of what we're going to call the business idea. The business idea is really the starting point of the process, indeed, of strategic planning. The focal question that really guides us in our environmental scan, the environmental scan itself, the process we go through to build the alternative scenarios, and then finally how we test the business idea. So you'll notice that after we've dealt with the focus of scenario planning, we start with a business idea and we end off with a business idea. And that's because scenario planning really starts with the business as you imagine it to be now. The business idea really describes the business as it is now. And at the end of the process, we come right back to that and we say, now, given these changes in the environment, how will this business idea really work in the future? More of that as we go through it. So let's start off by discussing some of the key things about scenario planning. And this is probably the most important thing I'm going to say, and I'm going to spend a bit of time on this. Scenario planning is about building the capabilities for the future. It is not about predicting the future. So we don't use scenario planning to predict what is going to happen in 5-10 years' time. We use scenario planning to understand how best to build the capabilities of our business to cope with a range of futures down the track. So you might remember that the key thing about complex environments and doing strategy in uncertain conditions is that we have to have a range of futures. So we have alternative futures, 3-4 futures that could exist depending on how the various variables interact and the future unfolds. Scenario planning isn't to predict which one of these is going to occur. Scenario planning is about saying, what are the capabilities we will need if any of those do occur? So it's about capability building, really important. And there are certain situations in which we should be using scenario planning. Firstly, when there is no clear solution to the problem or challenge. A straightforward sort of question of how can we best move our office from this city to that city in a 6-month time period is not really an example to use scenario planning for. This is really where there are complex situations with multiple opinions on how to get there and where the future is going to lie. As I said, it's about environments in which there's medium to high uncertainty in the environment and multiple futures. It also has to be used in a situation where the organization is open to change. It's not only change about the kind of things it might have to do in the future, but also change in the way we're going to go about the normal strategy process. This is not a normal strategy process. This is a much more collaborative, much more interactive process, which uses a lot of different techniques to conventional strategic planning. The organization's also got to be open to dialogue, meaning it's got to be happy to have a conversation inside the organization, which really debates and discusses the options and the alternatives. If this is an organization that wants to take 6 or 7 people in secret to a darkened room so that they might actually develop the future strategy without telling anyone about it or consulting with anyone, then this is not the ideal environment to use scenario planning in. You've also got to have a leader who will control and manage the process and take responsibility for the outcomes. This really needs someone to take ownership of the process and steer it all the way through, and really coordinate all the activities that have to take place, and then be prepared to defend the outcomes once they've come out at the other end. There needs to be time. You can't complete a scenario planning process in 2 days or an afternoon or a weekend retreat. You need a little more time. It's going to take you sometimes 4 to 6 weeks to do, and you've got to dedicate the time for that. And finally, you've got to be prepared to make available the resources and time, generally for external facilitation and support. It's only because no monarchy ever foments its own overthrow. The management team, the leadership group of the organization, have too much vested interests in the way things are, and they would always imagine a future where they were still in control. So generally speaking, you need someone a little more objective, a little more independent to support and facilitate the process. So those are some of the requirements that you might think of that need to be in place if we are to do a decent job on scenario planning or scenario thinking. Incidentally, we tend to use the term scenario thinking and scenario planning quite interchangeably, but scenario thinking is the thinking process you go through when you do a scenario plan. That's in essence the key distinction. So, what are the key steps then in the scenario thinking process? We'll go through these quickly, as I said, show you the process, but remember that we will cover off each of these sections in a lot of detail as you go through the various stages yourself. So, step 1 is to define the value proposition or business idea. We often use the term value proposition in exchange for business idea. There are some subtle differences, but for the moment, it's about asking why you're doing what you're doing. What's the purpose of this business? The second stage is to set up the focal question. And that is about saying, what is it about this environment that is likely to change? So what is this environment that will change? What environment are we interested in? And there's a reason for doing that, because if we're interested in a future for telecommunications in a particular country, we may not be interested in the fact that there's swine flu in another country. It may not affect the environment that we're interested in. Thirdly, we identify the key uncertainties by, in essence, doing a scenario plan, an environmental scan. And the environmental scan is really about asking ourselves, what are the key uncertainties that will change in this environment? Fourthly, we use those key uncertainties to build future scenarios. So we take the current uncertainties as they exist, and we use that to build future scenarios. And then we come right back to the original value proposition or business idea, and we ask ourselves, what are the key gaps that exist in this future strategy that we now need to build into our business idea so that we've actually got a workable strategy for the future? So those are the 5 steps, and I'll just run through them very quickly with you. Defining the business idea is pretty much, as you may have remembered from Derek Abell's work on defining the business idea. So we know the business idea, or defining the business, consists of who the customers are, what products are being served to them, and then finally why these are being served. And it's the last one, the why question, the value proposition, which is the core of the business idea. So that's the starting point that we go through. So the first part of the exercise is for you to actually think about the business idea in terms of the job you're doing for the customer or the value you're adding for the customer. And we will go through this in a lot more detail in the next video when you actually begin to do this. The second stage is to then define the focal question. As I mentioned, the focal question really concerns identifying which market you're interested in. And it's the market into which your business idea is focused. So the question is important because it focuses the environmental scan. So for example, if we're looking to define the future of the agricultural market in a particular part of the world, we may not be interested in the fact that they've developed a new technology for virtual imaging of the medical industry in another. Um, and so the question is that the environmental scan has to be relevant to the market that you're interested in. So the focal question talks about the change that might occur in this market for your business idea. And so in a sense, what we're trying to understand is how is the market for your business idea or your value proposition going to change in the future? That's the second kind of stage of the exercise, to focus the environmental scan. And so we ask you to think about the market into which your business idea is going, and how's it going to change, or what does the future of that market look like? The third stage is to say, when we do our environmental scan, what are the key uncertainties that exist in that particular environment? What are the key uncertainties that could change that market into the future? And you'll see I'm going to ask you to become quite specific in that particular case. I don't want you to use broad general terms like technology will change. I want you to describe the actual uncertainty you have about the technology. So for example, you might say something like, well, the uncertainty we have is that technology may be capable of diagnosing a patient's condition continuously and therefore disrupt the conventional or traditional approach whereby we visit the doctor on a regular basis. So you might be interested, for example, in how you set up medical clinics. And so if you say technologies uncertainty, then you need to actually talk about specifically what you mean by that. So that's why I say be quite specific. So we ask you to use the usual PESTEL analysis: political, economic, social, technology, legal, environmental. And we ask you to identify the key uncertainties in that market and try to keep that to about 5 or 6. The second part of the environmental scan is to prioritize those key uncertainties. So the way we do that is we use a particular grid, which is similar to those that you might have seen in other courses, where what we rate is firstly the impact that this uncertainty will have on the market. If it's a high impact uncertainty, it means this uncertainty is really going to radically change the direction and nature of the market. Or low impact means it won't have much impact. And then the second thing we're asking you to rate is how certain you are about it occurring. If you're totally uncertain about it occurring, it goes in the right-hand side, because that means we've got to plan for it if it occurs. But if we're certain that it is going to occur, well, then we don't really need to do any scenario planning on that. We should just plan. You know, if we know that on the 1st of January 2022, such and such a change is happening in the market, well, then we can actually plan for it right now. There's no uncertainty about that. There's just really a choice to be made about how we're going to respond. So this is about prioritizing the uncertainties of the environmental scan. So the third part of the process is an environmental scan to identify the uncertainties and then to prioritize them. So we rate the uncertainties, the impact, we rate the level of uncertainty, and we plot them on the grid. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to identify the top 2 critical factors. Now, the fourth stage is where we take those critical uncertainties, or the 2 major big ones, and we use them to build the future scenarios. How do we do that? Well, we choose the 2 factors that are most impactful and most uncertain. These are the ones that best describe the uncertainty in the market. And we really use those 2 factors to actually make up the axes of our model, axis 1 and axis 2. And once we've identified what those axes are, we then identify the polar extremes, the opposite ends of the axis, A and B. And that then helps us build a sort of scenario model, and we have this grid in which 4 scenarios exist. So scenario 1 is a combination of axis 1 and axis 2. Scenario 3 is a combination of axis 2 and axis 1, and so on. And so, in a sense, the 2 critical uncertainties, which are the ones at the top right-hand corner, become the 2 axes for our model, and that model then drives and creates 4 scenarios. So exercise 4 is to identify the 2 critical uncertainties, define the opposites of each one, and then these 2 critical uncertainties become the 2 axes of your model, and then we can name and describe what scenario 1, 2, 3, and 4 looks like. And we will go through this in a lot more detail. And the last stage is where we test the original value proposition or the original business idea. And now what we're looking at is, what are the key changes that exist for the future? What are the key changes we will have to make for the future? So if we imagine each scenario as a wind tunnel, as a set of conditions. So scenario 1 is really a world that looks like scenario 1, and scenario 2, and scenario 3, scenario 4. There are 4 different versions of what the future can be. We then take our business idea and we use the scenarios to what we know as wind tunnel. So we literally place our business idea in each of those scenarios. So the original business idea is tested in each scenario in much the same way as a wind tunnel tests the air resistance of a motor car. The wind tunnel here, which is the scenario, tests the viability of our existing business idea. And we ask ourselves, how well will it perform? And as we do that, we identify the key strengths and key weaknesses of the original business idea or value proposition in each scenario. And this tells us what changes we have to make for the future. And once we've done that, once we've identified the key strengths and weaknesses and the common strengths and weaknesses, we then have all the information we require to really begin assembling the future strategy and the future capabilities needed by the organization. So this little framework over here is a summary of the strengths of the business idea under each scenario and the weaknesses of the business idea under each scenario. We take this information and we apply it to our future strategy, and that's another section altogether. So the purpose of scenario planning then is ultimately to test the viability of our business idea under a range of different conditions. And those different conditions are represented by the 4 scenarios. So read the little workbook there called Future Building, and you'll see each of these steps is clearly described and explained in that book, in that reading. But also remember that we will be going through each particular stage to help you build your scenario plan in your syndicates and to guide you for when you have to do your individual assignment for your own scenario plan. So this was just an overview of the whole process, and it shows you how all the steps work together to produce, at the end of the day, the key strengths and weaknesses in the original business idea, because those represent the key gaps for future strategy. Okay, I know that's been a very quick kind of look at the whole process, but I wanted to give you an understanding of the end-to-end sort of approach we take. And what each video from now on will do is it'll look at each element in the process and give us a chance to explore it, understand it, and apply it as we build our scenario plan in our syndicates and for our own individual assignment. Right, thank you very much. I hope that was useful. Look forward to seeing you in the next video.